Hello, where does the story of Korean Americans begin? This is a topic that I'll be sharing at the Korean American and Asian American Studies Curriculum Conference, which is actually this Saturday, November the 19th. So it's not yet Saturday, November the 19th, but sometimes what I like to do is I like to practice my presentation before I get there. It's going to be at UCI, and they've invited teachers and scholars and educators and administrators and of course, the team that I frequently work with, including Dr. Grace Cho, TC Kim, Hera Kwan. In fact, the lesson I'm going to be talking about, Dosan Anchang Ho's lesson, is adapted by Hera Kwan, and that's a lesson I'll be sharing. And Virginia Nguyen, who I've had a chance to work with for Teaching for Justice Conference as well, and others, of course, including Kelly Fong, who is one of the folks that are helping to create the digital API textbook. Not out yet, but soon to be. I'll go ahead and introduce myself to various folks that I'm a middle and high school teacher, instructional coach, civic lead, and teacher educator. I've also helped write the Korean American Studies course that is being written and hopefully board approved this year, the year-long course that I'm developing right now. So I might begin with this Fist of Five for understanding. I do like to interact with the audience. And where would you be at in this group here as well? I'm familiar with Korean American history, and I know where I could get started to teach Korean American studies to my students. Where would you be at all? Where would you be on this? Would you be like, no, I kind of don't know where I would begin, or yeah, I would need some significant help. I could use some practice up to five, like maybe you're the person that wrote the book on Korean American studies. We do have folks that have done that too, and so thankful that they have. So where are you at? And for any of you who are like kind of like this or like one, yeah, I just want you to know that I can kind of relate because when I was young, I never had a teacher that looked like me, and also I never learned my own story, and that's kind of where we begin here. Just letting folks kind of think about why it's important to have students know their story, tell their story, listen to their story, have others listen to their story with empathy and respect, and then do something good with their story. I'm going to share a little bit about my kids and how, we were at Trader Joe's one day. I was locking up my bike, and a couple was walking by and said, wow, a lot of Chinese people are moving into our neighborhood. And once again, nothing wrong with Chinese folks, but I'm second generation Korean American, and my children then are third generation Korean American here in the United States. And I just wondered, I wonder how long they are being perceived as kind of like other, like foreign, right? Um, Once again, when someone does not understand anything about or knows very little about a person's culture, it's not that there's no value. Sometimes there's a negative connotation. Here's actually an experience that one of my students had when I had them do the ethnography story of resilience, where they kind of talked about their experience about how their home culture adds value to America. This is what one student wrote. One thing my home culture brings into America is K-pop. Not exactly value, but it brought respect and got noticed for this. I remember when I was younger, this girl asked me where I was from, and I answered South Korea. And she laughed and said, so you come from nowhere. And she really didn't know where it was. And this is a situation when you kind of don't know anything about another culture, or maybe you have stereotypes, and all you know is stereotypes and biases. Sometimes it leads to comments like this. But to check this out, once she kind of gets into K-pop, but 6 years later, she claimed to be a fan of K-pop and claimed to love Korea. Wow, just this. I mean, is K-pop Korean American history? K-pop is more part of the Hallyu movement of Korea, and yet just even knowing a little bit at least really transformed this individual from one who was kind of like, you don't come from nowhere, to somebody who was like, loved Korea, right? So that's so interesting. That's so interesting to me, which is why I think it's so important to know things about other people's culture, other people's history, because that grows empathy and compassion. But once again, there has been a lack. Some people say that there hasn't been just one pandemic, but two pandemics. And one of the pandemics being, of course, COVID-19. And if I were to ask folks, hey, why is there this surge in anti-Asian racism? A lot of people would say, oh, because of COVID-19 and connected to that in some way. Um, but you could even say maybe it's a resurgence of anti-Asian sentiments. But definitely there has been a resurgence, right? So in 2020, OC Human Relations has reported an 1,800% increase of anti-hate, Asian hate incidents. 1,800% in 2020. Wow, it's just like unthinkable for me in some ways, like how that could be increasing. And this isn't some other state or other part of California. This is where I live, Orange County. This is where I'm recording from. I'm out here in Orange County, and there's an 1,800% increase in anti-Asian hate. And yet, I would dare say that a lot of people may not know about this, that it's quite like this, 1,800%. And some of it is more, more mild, like name calling, things like that. Those are things that, like, I definitely have experienced all throughout my life, even till today, to more violent type of acts. So in that middle picture, you see this person being pushed down. He's a 91-year-old man just walking, minding his own business, and he's pushed down with great force. This has happened to a lot of our elderly. In fact, it's mainly and primarily women and elderly that are being attacked. And in a lot of these situations, it's not, and I'm not saying people should get mugged or robbed, but I just can kind of understand that a little bit. Like, you're really desperate, right? But when you're just senselessly beating down like someone who's elderly, and then just leaving them there, some to even die, that's a different kind of hate. And so it makes me wonder, can it get, like, what is worse than this, right? Could it get any worse, right? Fortunately, there's some spaces where work is happening. Just this past month, I was a part of OCAPICA. I created this vlog on Community to Congress, where community members here in OC are telling their stories, and it's really powerful hearing stories of, in this situation, women here, some just blocks away from where I live, and experiencing a lot of. You should hear their stories. I had in the YouTube video link, the actual interview itself, that panel, where you can hear the different stories. And then to Congress, there's actually 3 Congress folks that were there, and they're listening, and they're thinking about what can we do to stop API hate, right? So where do you think this hate came from, right? Now, some people might say, once again, COVID-19, but I would say maybe it goes further back to the very beginning of when, Chinese Americans, and there, of course, even before that, but Chinese Americans invited to come to America to work, help build the railroad, and working super hard until they were excluded in 1882, the first group by race to be excluded, and then eventually all Asian Americans by 1924. So, with those Exclusion Act, it almost gave like a permission to have a lot of racism happen. Another key moment, surge, I would say, in racism toward Korean Americans was the Saigu event, 429, 30 years ago in LA, the civil unrest that occurred there. And a part of the reason why this may be happening is because, rather than like having no knowledge about Korean Americans or Asian Americans, there actually are ideas like the model minority myth, that all Asian Americans are this monolith and, outperforming all these other groups. And so therefore to be, seen in a particular way, right? Yellow peril, this idea that, there's something dangerous about these folks. And so with COVID-19, that anyone can pass COVID-19 to another person, but this feeling like, oh, but if you're this particular group, then you're more dangerous, right? And then the idea of the persistent foreigner. I gave that example of my own children. They're 3rd generation Korean American. They've never been to Korea, and yet seen like a foreigner. It feels like, at least feels like a foreigner sometimes in our own country. And I'm saying this because I don't want to feel like a foreigner on my own country. I love my country, right? And so this has caused concern. And I think if it was just for me, just happening to Dr. Jeff, I'd be like, I could take it. I've taken it all my life, like various slurs, things like that. But when my students, however, express concern, fear, that concerned me deeply. That um, I don't know. I don't know. That hurt my feelings. That moved me to action. Here's a quote from one of my students. This is during the pandemic. Schools are never shut down. We're just teaching online, which is pretty remarkable considering, like, just immediately on a dime, we were able to pivot and deliver instruction in a completely different way, which is remarkable. But anyways, even in these spaces, students were vulnerable and able to connect with their teachers. And one of my students said, I'm a Pacific Islander and fall under that category. I've witnessed and heard all the horrendous and disgusting words and actions we were facing. It's extremely heartbreaking to see my community in pain because of who they are. I was wondering if I could share out an explanation of how it's impacting me, how we can help, why it's so important to stand up and use our voice. And so when I had students like this reaching out to me, I just wanted to do something, with them to support them in this action. So one thing that we did was we did something called a Know Better campaign of how we can be a part of a social media campaign to show what it's like to know better and treat each other with kindness and respect during the COVID-19 pandemic. So all these students of mine, they created PSAs and T-shirt, artwork, mosaics, stories. And once again, in addition to the civic engagement, they're also growing their compassion and their communication and their collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking because they're responding to this real-world driving question that they're passionate about. So I didn't think it could get any worse than, at least I just wasn't thinking about it getting worse than elderly folks getting pushed down. But then when this happened, the 6 women that were killed in the Atlanta shootings, I just couldn't be silent on this topic anymore. These names, some of them sound like people I know, and like my own parents, my own mom. And I thought, in my mind, it might be difficult for some of those folks, first generation folks. Most Asian Americans came to the United States post 1965 because of the Immigration Act, which had excluded so many Asian Americans from coming from Asia, whereas not from other places. And so many of the first generation folks struggle with, actually, many actually are very familiar with English. It's just they just have a very strong accent at times, very strong accent that comes out, and it's sometimes not respected by some people. And this is where I felt like, you know what, you just can't be silent on this, Jeff. You got to do something about it. And what is something that I could do in response? Now, some people, they respond out of fear and anger. And I mean, I can understand that. I mean, we can acknowledge fear and anger that can happen when we see some of these horrific things happening. But how can we respond out of fear, not out of fear and anger, but out of love and wisdom? And I thought, you know what? I think a way to respond with love and wisdom is through building this Korean American, Asian American Studies course. Like, if I were to create this course that would help students to know and tell their story, like students know their story, they are familiar with their story, and they actually tell their story to another, and then others listen with empathy and respect, and then they do something good together. I just felt like that would be a step in the right direction. So a lot of people, there's a lot of confusion around ethnic studies. I just like to think of it as know, tell, listen, and do. And in doing so, not only are they growing their 5 C's, they're growing their compassion, they're growing their agency, they're growing their civic action. And I think it's a good thing. In addition to that, I think there's some benefit to finding out, your own identity. Who am I? What is your purpose? There's all that benefit as well. Also, I think it's very American, this idea of each person having a lot of value. At least that was the spirit of our country. And in our country, we're just so culturally blessed, color blessed, more than most countries in the globe, in the world, right? So how can we culturally honor one another? And if we're able to do this well, wow, we can really be not only leaders here in our own community, in our own country, but all across the world, because this is something that folks struggle with. how to be color blessed, how to be culturally honoring, and this is something that people are working on. And so as we grow toward greater harmony, tranquility, peace, blessing for everyone, this is a part of that becoming a more perfect union that we're talking about. So I feel like it's a very American thing to do, as well as a very compassionate thing as well. But once again, this is a tough thing for teachers to address. Even in the district that I work in, we're encouraged to know our students by name, need, asset, stories, and passions. And that's really awesome goal, right? But what if a student doesn't know their own story? And by the way, when I say that, I'm not saying it's the student's fault or anything like that, because I didn't even know my own story, growing up until later. I didn't know my own history. I never had a teacher that looked like me in all my K through 12 education. Never had a chance to learn my Korean American history. I really didn't know the full story of my parents either, just a little bit. Sometimes the immigrant experience and the language barrier makes it difficult for the second generation to really understand their parents' story. And that's why I'm saying it's like very important to like get these stories now, because I mean, by the time the third generation is interesting, maybe the first generation, will they be there? Will they not? I hope they are, but sometimes it's not easy to transfer the story. It could be a lost story, right? So there's a lot of stories I don't know about my parents, but I'm glad that I'm getting to know more of these stories, because I think that connects to who am I? And that's a question that a lot of adolescents are asking. I know that in this country, so many youth struggling with mental health. And in fact, just today I was at our city's prayer breakfast, and it was in support of children that had been gone through some abuse, and it's a support system for them. And then the speaker asked us to envision like the Angel Stadium, right? And the Angel Stadium full. I think it's about 50,000 that could fit in the Angel Stadium. That's a lot of people, right? Then she said, multiply that times 4, and then you got the idea of how many young people have had suicidal ideation in just this past year. And that's scary. That so many young people have had that thought in their mind. And I wonder if, if some folks understood who they are, they had answered the question, who am I? If that might have helped their mental health. If they understood, oh, this is where I've come from, this is who I am, this is where I'm going. And then also understanding their story of resilience, right? So, for example, I mentioned how I didn't know my mom's story very well. Well, I knew my father's story. He has another story of resilience, but my mom's story is one that I didn't know. She actually was born. This is before the Korean War, before there was two Koreas, North Korea and South Korea. In fact, I was just at the Korean consulate, and they were celebrating Korea National Day, and that's celebrating 4,000 years of Korean history, of Korea being one nation. So it's more of a recent thing that there's a North and South Korea, but for a lot of people, that's all folks know. But anyways, my mom was born on the north side of that prior to the war. So, it's a problem, right? Because we know what has happened since then. And so they knew that, there was some problems happening in the north. So my grandparents, they fled with my mother, who was an infant at the time. And my grandfather went first to secure a place in South Korea, while my grandmother, they got stuck. They got stuck at the border. Now, it's not the same as it is today, the DMZ, which is like no one's crossing that. But they had a kind of border even before the Korean War was in place, where people couldn't just cross freely, even though they wanted to live in a democracy. My mom shares, I have a YouTube on her sharing her story, where it kind of begins in North Korea, what is now North Korea, and her wanting to flee, her mom wanting to flee to South Korea, and getting caught, and then wondering if they should go back to their hometown in North Korea, as they had been told by the people that had caught them and had put in the prison for a while. But no, they went for it again. And you can imagine my mom being an infant, my grandmother alone, and she has her hanbok, her traditional Korean clothing. It's freezing cold in Korea at that time, and then babies, if diapers, things like that, right? So she was ripping her hanbok and making diapers for my mom, who's a baby and nervous that her crying is going to alert her as they're trying to cross the Han. It's stressful, so stressful, right? But they're survivors, and then they experienced the Korean War after that. And this is actually post the occupation of Korea by Japan, which my grandparents went through, which is pretty rough in Korea. And then the Korean War, and then of course, then there was a miracle of the Han, where Korea is now one of the most wealthiest nations in the world, ranked 10, right? But at this time, during the Korean War, maybe they were like one of the poorest countries in the world. So this is a great story, right, of a nation, and a great story of my mom. I just saw her as, like before, like a very well-to-do graduate of Ewha University, women's university, well-educated, influential kind of person. I didn't know that she had this other part of her story, but then that's a story of resilience. But for some reason, that part, she never told me that part until more recently. I could have not known that for my rest of my life, actually. So I'm so glad that story surfaced, mainly thanks to my sister, who was asking these questions. And so I appreciate her. And so it's a total story of resilience, a story of resilience for my mother, but also it's a story of resilience to me when I face adversity and challenges. Can I listen to my mom's story and think about her story and think, you know what, Jeff, you're gonna make it, you're gonna survive, you're gonna get through this. This is gonna make you stronger. Yeah, that's gonna help me. That's gonna help my mental health. That's gonna help all kinds of things, right? Because I know my story. Right? But what if I don't know my story? If I don't know my story, then maybe all I'm going to be left with are the deficits, like, oh, my parents speak with an accent, or why can't they blah blah blah, right? So sometimes I remember feeling like that a little bit in my youth, so rather than feeling proud and understanding the story of resilience, kind of feeling a little bit of like a little bit shy about really you know talking about my parents too much. And by the way, if you're interested in more stuff about Korean Americans, ethnic studies, and also other topics like civic engagement, learning, classroom management, and more, I do have my Ed Family YouTube channel where I have a lot of different topics. And when people talk about where do you begin teaching about Korean American studies, because once again, we talked about how a lot of people don't know their own story, right? Well, you just begin with your curiosity. And so maybe you're going to begin with like Colonel Young Kim and how he was the first person. He was a Korean American to lead the 442nd Regiment. This was the Japanese American regiment that was separate from all the others, because at that time, during World War II, Japanese Americans had been interned in the United States. But and at that time, Korea was also colonized by Japan. But Colonel Young Kim said, you know what? I'm American, they're American, we're going to fight as Americans. He really embodies what it looks like to live in multiracial America. Or Dr. Sammy Lee, who was a back-to-back gold medal in Olympic platform diving, and he couldn't practice in the public pool, or he could one day a week for when it was for the people of color. And but yet he won this back-to-back gold platform diving. It's a story of resilience. Or how about I talked about Saigu, the 1992 LA civil unrest. Some people say that was the day where Koreans were like, where the Korean American identity was reborn, and this desire to integrate and connect with other ethnic groups. It's a great story of intersectionality. Or the story of Korean American unity for independence. Yugon Sun in Korea, who was an active organizer in the March 1st movement. I think this is a great story for girls, but for everyone, of how a young girl really mobilized the March 1st movement for the independence of Korea when Korea was a colonized country. And I bet a lot of the ideas of that March first movement came from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And also, if you look at the Declaration of Independence from that March 1st movement, and also our own Declaration of Independence from the United States of America, there's a lot of similarities. A lot of similarities. So it's really cool seeing this intersection between the United States and Korea, actually. And Korea coming out of colonized Japan. And once again, one of the most poorest nations after the Korean War. But today, after the Hallyu movement, Korea is the 10th most wealthy nation, and so much culture just being pushed out of Korea, where it's impacting the world now. But the lesson I'm going to share today is first Korean Americans, right? So we're going to go to the first Korean American settlement at Pachapa Camp in 1905, Joseon Anchang-ho's story. Now, for me, even though I studied Asian American studies in college, I did not learn about Pachapa Camp, actually. And that may be because a lot of these stories, they're not like easily found in history books because the history had not been recorded. There are researchers out there like Dr. Edward Chang who are doing research and discovering documents and finding things that are helping these stories, these almost forgotten stories, to be resurfaced, and so that we can remember these stories of resilience. So when people hear that I'm teaching this Korean American Studies course, they oftentimes ask like, oh, what's exactly in this course? How do you teach it? And so once again, I like to begin with helping students to know and tell their story. So there's going to be a My Story assignment, a photo voice, ethnography, story resilience. I have YouTube videos in all these three modules to help students know and tell their story. But I think when students do that, I think it develops a comfort level that helps them connect with other people. They may never have talked about some of these kinds of things with themselves, their pet family, or even definitely not others in the class. So whether you're Korean American or any other group, there's this wonderful opportunity to bond with one another. Then to get kind of a big picture like timeline, there's this great book written by Edward Chang and Carol Park. I respect them so much. It's like a less than 100 pages read, and it's very concise, easy to read, plain, clear Korean American history. And so having my students do like an interactive journal. And then this is where, once again, you can begin anywhere, but the lesson I'm talking about is with Joseon Anchang-ho. And I have like many different projects from there that I'm pulling, including the Dr. Sam Lee story, or Letter to President Wilson, or Hallyu collage, lots of different projects that can come from those standards. And then there's this website here by the Korean American Studies Education Foundation. So if you look at this website, www.kasef.org, you'll find that there's like all these lessons that have curated materials, curated PowerPoints, curated videos that you could use to create your own lesson. So it could be the lesson that they have. You can kind of go along with it, modify it for your own demographic, your own students, your own grade level. Or you can kind of look at that content and then mix and match and kind of make it yours too. So I do a little bit of both with this resource, but I'm glad that the resource is there because, once again, it's not easy to find all this material in one place, but I'm glad that that material is there. And then, moving to the students creating this virtual museum. So now that the students have learned all this stuff about Korean American studies after some time, they're going to then start curating it into this virtual museum so that they themselves can be the docents of that museum. They can explain different parts of that museum to one another. And maybe they're going to also create screencasts of their portion of the museum so that others who come onto there virtually would be able to talk about it. And then, of course, kind of leading to civic action and where it could be like dialogue between students, parents, teachers, bringing people together to get understandings. Maybe it's soapbox speeches where students have a chance to identify a topic that they're passionate about and then do something good with it. Civic action projects, learning from our API and Korean American leaders. I recently became a part of the Council of Korean Americans, and there's just a huge network that's out there. folks. I just haven't tapped into as much as I want to yet. But this is a wonderful opportunity for students to meet other leaders in fields that maybe they haven't had the chance to see otherwise. So as they're doing this work, right, this Korean American studies, I know once again in the Asian American community, there's this real focus on AP testing and testing. And in fact, I went to a Korean parent meeting recently, and they're asking about the mental health of their youth. And I think this heavy focus on the testing, I don't know if that is beneficial for every person's mental health, right? When it's just this specific emphasis on like just kombu, study in Korean, right? So, but what if they were like learning about their identity? What if they're learning about their own story? What if they're thinking about what they can do with compassion for another? What if they're, I think that would help them. I think that would help them, their mental health, first of all. Second of all, these days with colleges, I don't think they're just looking at like GPAs and AP test scores, and in some schools not even looking at the SAT anymore, right? So what might they be looking at? They're looking at like you being able to tell a story, you being able to talk about like your passions, your interests, what you've done, right? Which I think then leads to also the career connection, because if I were to go into a career, typically they're not asking like how many AP tests did you pass. Even as a teacher, I don't think they really even ask that question, right? So what are they looking for? Like communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, compassion, cultural sensitivity, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, like DEI, right? So all these things can definitely be a benefit for that student who is entering a diverse world. So yes, they're learning about Korean American studies, but it's not just for Korean American students and only about Korean American studies, but because of the intersectionality, this is Korean American studies. So there's a lot of intersectionality with other groups. And so you're learning so much about the whole country, actually, but through the lens that students can really benefit from, right? Could also include connections to the Google Project Management Certificate. So many jobs these days, and maybe that civic engagement could be connected to Google Project Management, which our district is offering to so many students. I could maybe connect it to that. All right, so that's like the long way then to this lesson, the first Koreatown and the legacy of Dosan and Changho. And where did I get this Google slide from? I got it from the materials. What material? Remember that website I was talking about? The www.kasef.org website. It's coming from there. And they even have questions, discussion questions, like what were the characteristics of the first Koreatown in Riverside? Who was Dosan Changho? What was life like for immigrant and women workers in early California citrus industry? What contributions did he make to California and the United States? What contributions did he make to the Korean American community? What contributions did he make to Korea? So they're leading with these questions, like, right? Better change that to what, right? So I might show this video from Dr. Echeng on the first Koreatown, and then start talking about Dosan Changho, how he was born in Korea but immigrated to the United States in 1902. And he actually came as a married couple. And, some of you might think everyone would come as a married couple, right? But during this time, a lot of times only the men came because it was very difficult to have the couple come, and later very difficult for the women to come. Prior to the 1982 Exclusion Act for Chinese American, preceding that was actually the Page Act, which made it very difficult for women to come to the United States. But anyways, we're talking about 1902, but this is very close, as you can see, to the Chinese exclusion. So Chinese were invited, they helped build the railroad, then this feeling of this anti-Asian sentiment, the surge in anti-Asian sentiment, right? But why allow Koreans to come? Why allow Japanese to come? Why allow other Asians to come besides the Chinese? Because there's the need for labor, right, in the United States, and so they're invited to come to work because there's that need for labor. And anyways, Dosan and Changho's the first married couple with his wife to come, And one of the first things he does is he creates this friendship society. And that goal is to just connect with other Koreans, other Korean Americans, and help each other in this country. Because there's some really bad, negative anti-Asian attitudes in San Francisco, but all across, the country. For example, this past spring, I went to this ceremonial signing of Chinatown Apology in Santa Ana. So I went to Santa Ana. I didn't know that there was a Chinatown in Santa Ana. Actually, it's not a Chinatown anymore, but there used to be one. But it was burned down. And it was one of many Chinatowns that were burned down during this time period, during this surge in anti-Asian racism. And you got to remember, why were these Chinatowns there to begin with? Because some folks are like, why are the Asians just hanging out by themselves, Well, at that time, they had to live there. So you could only live in certain areas. You could only buy a rent. I don't think many Asians could buy land. So they actually had to rent in only certain areas, right? So they were kind of in these ethnic enclaves, you could say. For their own safety too, because there's a lot of attacks happening then. There was a surge in anti-Asian racism, right? Then. But there was this economic opportunity of Riverside, which is what brought Dosan and Chung Ho out there, the citrus industry. And a lot of people don't know this, but in California, actually, Riverside was like the place in the early 1900s. Like that was, if you had money, that was the place. Of course, Koreans couldn't really access a lot of the jobs that were more lucrative, but they could access jobs like cooking, cleaning, yard work. I have this another video on why were there so many Chinese restaurants. And one of the reasons why in that video is because that's one of the only jobs that they could have to make a living at the time, right? So they're limited in their economic choices. So oftentimes these first Korean Americans were hired out through labor contractors. And what Dosan Chung Ho was, he helped to facilitate that. And these workers, he coached them, he supported them, he helped make the connections, and he encouraged them to work hard because, it was part of their reputation of being able to be so good at what they did that kept on getting them the opportunity, right? So it was this settlement was founded by Dosan and Chung Ho, and it was a family-based community. Once again, this is very different than some of the bachelor communities for Chinese Americans because Chinese women were excluded for so long in our country. But for many Korean Americans, they're actually able to bring a bride, or they're able to come over in a different kind of way. So we're talking about 200 residents at Pachapa Camp by 1907. That's not a huge number, but yet a very important group that was able to do a lot in setting the culture and tone of future Korean Americans that would come. So this lesson actually looks at three different groups because, once again, we're talking about Korean Americans, but looking at the Korean American story allows you to also look at some other groups as well and then create this understanding between groups, similarities and differences. So the students are going to be looking at three different kinds of workers during this time period. The first on the left, as you can see here, is women, white women. And then you got Dosan and Chung Ho's group, first Korean Americans, and then you also have Mexicans as well. So what were their experiences like? So they read these three articles, and then what happens is as they read those three articles, then they're able to kind of look at the characteristics of what citrus industry was like during this time period, creating a Venn diagram. What was it like for women? What was it like for Korean? What was it like for Mexicans? And each one is going to read this article, and I'll share that in a moment. But let me go back to Dosan and Chung Ho's story. He starts the Korea National Association. If you remember, from 1910 to 1945, Korea has been colonized at this point. So his goal is for an independent Korea. He's really thinking, as a Korean American, I want Korea's independence from Japan. And part of that is, I'm sure there's that love for Korea, but maybe another part of that is I don't think he could become an American citizen at this time as well. So he's wanting Korea to become established. And in 1919 helped establish the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai. So this idea of a Korea outside of Korea, because Korea had been colonized by Japan, and difficult to have a Korea there. So here's a map of Asia. You can see China here, Russia. People don't know this, but Russia's border is actually very close to, actually touches North Korea. But this was all one Korea at the time, and then the Japanese Empire. So some people have said, is Korea kind of like this shrimp among these whales of China, Russia, and Japan? Or is Korea like this, or at least as Japan might see it, like this dagger that would allow China to come into Japan? And if you remember, there are like stories of different campaigns through Korea into Japan that happened before, so that I could see where that fear might be there. But anyways, Japan comes in 1910, and that colonization of Korea is pretty rough from 1910 to 1945. Like, you can't speak Korean, schools don't teach Korean, you can't worship any other religions. You sometimes are forced to serve in various work areas. Of course, comfort women. I'm not going to get into that, but lots of things happening to Korea during this time. A lot of exploitation of Korea for the benefit of Japan. And so Dosan Chang-ho is engaged in anti-Japanese activities that promote Korean independence. But what ends up happening is he ends up getting deported from the United States when someone reports that he is a Bolshevik. He's like, and he's trying to start some type of communist, socialist revolution. So he gets interrogated by the Department of Immigration, and he actually gets deported out of the country. And so this is kind of a rough situation. I can only imagine. His family continues to stay in the United States while his cause, he doesn't stop. He still promotes Korean independence, which is why I could see, Koreans being very honoring of Dosan Chang-ho. But he gets accused of anti-Japanese activities, and he gets arrested while he's in China. And then he gets sent to Taehoen prison, where he's tortured and abused pretty badly. And they let him leave, but then he dies in a hospital from his injuries. And that's Dosan Chang-ho's story, this Korean American. His family, 5 children, they continue on. Philip, Philson, Susan, Sora, Ralph. Some of them, once again, second generation now, born in the United States, serving in the United States Army, right, the military. And then we have Susan On Cuddy was first female gunnery officer in the U.S. Navy, and then Philip On was an actor. So big legacy from that family. So after I give a little presentation to the students, then now here we are able to assign the activity. And there's a driving question here. How were the lives of immigrant Koreans, Mexicans, and women in the early 1900s similar and different from one another? And then I like to have a we can statement, what it is that students are going to do for that particular day. And on this day, they're going to say, we can use our sea of critical thinking and our sea of compassion to compare and contrast the lives of early immigrant Koreans, Mexicans, and women in the early 1900s. And so they're looking at those 3 articles. Remember the one about Pachapa Camp, the one from a woman's view, the one from Mexican in the citrus industry, all in the citrus industry. They're looking at those 3 different stories. And these Google slides, once again, come from the curriculum that I was just sharing earlier, that website. And so in addition to the PowerPoint slide that gave a little background, they actually give these template for students to, from the article, write like a little information about that particular article. So type of article, bibliographic information, summary information, analysis, reflection. Then they kind of put them all on one grid. So each student in a group of 3 reads a different article, but then they talk about what it is that they read, and they summarize the key points. And then they talk about the similarities and differences, what was similar, what was different. And then they leave with some conclusions, like what have you learned about the first Koreatown and similarities and differences to Korean immigrant, Koreans, women, and how does this story add to your own story of resilience? So that's what the students are doing. And they grow a lot through this experience. Here's an actual student example from this group. Slightly change their names: Joe, Ka, Mad, Adi. So these are the 3 articles. And so, I'll just read this first one. An Chang-ho moved to Riverside in March 23rd, 1904 because the town's amount of Korea population, the amount of anti-Asian hate, and low amounts of opportunities for Koreans. After moving to Riverside, An Chang-ho establishes the first Koreatown in the U.S. with the help of wealthy citrus farm owner. He's able to get Korean immigrant jobs and make an association to help Koreans in the future. The association proves to be very significant in organizing immigrants to fight for independence from Japan's rule in 1910, and also in helping Koreans anchor their identity along with supporting their struggles. And even though the association doesn't exist anymore, the cultural impact of it can be remembered by a statue that was built. The most interesting thing I learned from this article was the struggles that Koreans had to go through when immigrating to a new country, and the amount of anti-Asian hate that was present at that time was shocking to hear about. And from what I could see, I could tell from this article's authors well informed by the topic of first Koreatown. So that's just a little background, then also a little summary of the others. The students then created this little Venn diagram here, are like three columns here where they're looking at 3 articles together. And then they leave with some similarities and differences. What are some conclusions? Here's what some students wrote. Learned how minorities suffered to America's xenophobia and racism, and yet they all made a community of success, which is why this is such a story of resilience. Some people really struggle with looking at any parts of history that show something negative about, or what feels like negative about our country. But when we look at people who persevered, it becomes then a kind of story of resilience, a way to go, right? A way to follow. And so we're going to miss the opportunity if we don't examine both the good, the heroes, right? And also the painful moments, and processing those painful moments well. This person learned about the hardships that Koreans, Mexicans, and women faced. And sometimes when you are Korean American or Korean or Mexican or whichever group, it can be potentially isolating. But when you hear these stories about shared common experiences, it creates that intersectionality, empathy for different groups and stories, right? And I think we could use some empathy, because once we have that empathy, maybe we're going to start seeing a little bit less and less the resurgence of racism like we're seeing. So we're talking about it like a surge, like it's some kind of new thing, but you can see that this is something that has been ongoing in our history, in our story. Once again, resources on my Ed Family YouTube channel and lessons that you can easily find on the www.kasef.org. I'm going to have teachers kind of also reflect on what their 72-hour plan is. I should probably do an Ed Family YouTube video on this, but very quickly, oftentimes I find that if you don't apply what you've learned within 72 hours, sometimes you can go to a great PD and the next week be thinking, did I attend something? It's funny how it's like that. Just so how it's so busy for all of us. So thank you for staying with me this whole time. And I would ask you this question. I am familiar with Korean American history and know where I can get started to teach Korean American studies to my students. Where are you at now? Are you kind of still at, no, I don't know, understand at all? Or yeah, 1, 2? I doubt anybody moved from like a 1 to a 5, but if you just move one band up, you are making great progress. In fact, I'm just going to leave you with this quote here, and this is to remind you, hey, you don't have to know everything to begin from somewhere. And so Maya Angelou once said, do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better.